That's great. Thanks a lot. I love coming to California. People applaud before you even said anything. It's really a highlight. Thanks. And thanks for such a great turnout. This is fantastic. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take about 35, 40 minutes to talk through how CO2 is managed in Shell, but principally about CO2 pricing inside a major corporation. And then I think I've got about 10, 15 minutes for questions at the end. So I'm going to take this at quite a pace just to keep you interested. And I was told if I showed this at Yale, I'd have to take 5 minutes, but because it's Stanford, you guys will read it in 1 minute. So it's up. It's just the standard disclaimer I have to show. So first thing, right up front. So I'm a CO2 guy inside an oil company. It sounds to some a bit of an oxymoron, but I believe that Shell is one of the most progressive of the oil companies. So partly because of our tendency towards considering the long term, in Shell we accept climate change is real. We have done for 10, 15 years. We accept that a large part of it, if not the main part of the cause, is man-made emissions, and fossil fuels have got a major role there. You know, it's a very sobering thought when you work in CO2 management inside the incumbent that can really only lose in terms of product sales as we go forward unless we make our product more acceptable. So what you'll see is we recognise everything that's said by the IPCC and others. We have done scenarios work in this area, I think now for 10 years, that have really emphasised the need to manage the climate as we go forward. So it's to say that what I'm going to talk about here is with sincerity. So you're not talking to someone that's on the fringes of what happens in Shell. This is really core to how Shell manages its major business risks. Now on that basis, every 6 months, a company like Shell goes through a process which is to look at its major business risks. So the things that should keep the senior executive awake at nights. So for the past 6.5 years, the impact of climate change has been up there in the high box. So the board, the executive, accept the fact that there will be climate change and it needs to be managed. That's how material this risk is to us. So you can imagine the focus it puts on me. And in fact, before I joined Shell, amongst the many industries and positions I had, I worked in insurance. And if I was really being serious about this, it's not a risk to us, it's an uncertainty. We know that we're going to be impacted by climate change. We're just not sure exactly when and in what form. But anyway, it's to say this is treated very, very seriously. Other key thing is my background, I'm an economist, and I will have unashamed economic language. It's about risk management. And it may seem to some a bit cold-hearted, but it's very difficult inside industry, and particularly inside an oil company, to get people to step up to do something about climate change. So when the language is presented in the way of a major business risk, and it's about values and net present values and all the rest, it just helps people grasp the issue. So it's not seen as greenwash, it's not seen as reputation driven, it's good business sense about dealing with a major business risk. So I thought I'd just show you, so what is the Shell CO2 management strategy? And this is the kind of summary I always show. And again, a couple of things, I don't feel shamefaced about it. You won't see mention of Shell setting out to reduce its CO2 footprint per se. It's about making sure that our products are acceptable and our assets keep producing in the light of CO2 regulation. There will be CO2 regulation, absolutely. It's making sure that we always comply. And more than that, because we're in a business that's long-term in nature, so I have projects coming through for appraisal now that will still be producing in 40 or 50 years' time. We have to make sure that those projects, those assets, those businesses are capable of adapting in the future to suit future business needs. So it's sufficient to talk about being competitive in future to give me the license to make sure that these businesses, these projects build climate resilience into their plans. So 3 parts to the strategy, the yellow boxes, if you like. The first one is about risk management. So it's particularly about the hydrocarbons business. So making sure that fully compliant, we can go forward in an acceptable way that keeps us the right side of the law, and it makes sure that our CO2 intensity and the way that we operate are always in compliance. The second box is about new opportunities. It's a difficult one when you're looking for kind of, what can benefit from CO2 regulation when you're inside a hydrocarbons company, but not all fossil fuels are the same. So gas, for example, has got a big marketplace in power generation by taking out coal. You can get on a life cycle basis or savings of up to 50% against coal in power generation. So gas could be a beneficiary. Biofuels, another one. It's very difficult to find an acceptable replacement for gasoline and diesel in road transport. Biofuels is one of the few that offers real opportunities. So Shell has invested $12 billion in a new joint venture producing Brazilian sugarcane ethanol. Again, it's a bit of an upside. So you can sense, in an ideal world, what you'd be looking for is the perfect hedge. It's the selling umbrellas and selling ice cream type of thing you're after. What are the business activities that would benefit from the very thing that risks the core business? And then down at the bottom, this is the one that's often overlooked, but it's the change management. It's the pretty dull stuff that has to be done, and making sure that Shell as an organisation and Shell as a group of 95,000 people are prepared with the proper competencies to keep going forward. So that's another part of my responsibility. The final thing I'll say up here, if you just look up in the top right, the two blue boxes at the top there, that's where the focus of my activities lie. It's trying to make sure we've got the basis of resilient or robust assets and competitive products. So no doubt we'll get into questions about unburnable carbon or other things. That's where a lot of the work I do on that very concept is targeted at, making sure the business keeps rolling, the income keeps coming in for the shareholder. Yeah, just very quickly here, I mentioned before about Shell scenarios. I mean, inside Shell, it's one of the things I think differentiates us from other oil companies is there is a genuine, not just an interest, but a fascination with the long term. So the scenarios team are a very privileged group of people inside Shell. They are independent to the core business. When the scenarios are produced, they are rolled out with such intent and interest across the business you wouldn't believe it. But what it does is it really inspires this interest in decades rather than just years. And because of that, Shell is often, you'll hear many stories about Shell not predicting, but being prepared for the OPEC price shocks in the 1970s, the Berlin Wall coming down, and these types of things. Now, back in the mid-90s, there was a lot of talk about climate change and the need to deal with particularly CO2 emissions. So that started to affect the way that Shell was thinking about its own organisation, its own activities. So we really started looking at how you could change internal behaviours around about the mid-90s. Incidentally, project screening value, we get nervous about talking about CO2 pricing because we often get accused of kind of collusion with competitors. We call it shadow pricing. It kind of gives a hint as though this is the price you want to see. It's not intended to be. It's a project screening value. So in other words, every project, anywhere in Shell, any activities, whenever an investment is made, if it has CO2 emissions, it has to carry a value of $40 a tonne. So it's a flat $40. I'll say a bit more on that later, but that must carry $40 a tonne. That's a project screening value. Shorthand inside is PSV. But when you think about it, you'll think about it as the shadow carbon price or the shadow price. That's what I'm referring to with the PSV. We actually started, we had the classic wooden dollar scheme where we had an internal cap and trade system. It's the one that we all think up when we're in college or university. That's not a criticism, by the way. That's not suggesting you're idealistic. It's the one we all start with. Let's have an internal trading system. It was interesting. It took a lot of management in the late 90s, and it didn't change behaviours at all. It didn't affect the way that the businesses manage CO2. So what we found was around about the year 2000, it moved from a kind of internal trading system into a mandatory need to have a PSV, a shadow CO2 price. There were two values at that time, one for the developed world and one for the developing world. As we moved forward, that was used. It was kind of, the application of it was fairly loose. So it wasn't as tight as it needed to be. Around about 2005, it started to get tighter, and then we got more ambitious. And this was off the back of, at that time, there was a series of scenarios released, blueprints and Scramble. Executives started to get interested in CO2 management. Again, we were told to get CO2 management more grounded than what it had been. So it became more mandatory. That's when we really started to insist to make it a requirement that projects needed to value CO2 in their economics. But we had a relatively complicated way of doing that. I say relatively, it was simple to me. It was a table with 8 cells, and it had OECD, non-OECD, to 2020, to 2030, 2040, and 2050. Sounded easy, but the amount of gaming we found was incredible. We had projects in the US that claimed to really be Chinese projects, because that's where they were going to sell their product. And it was really driven by the fact that we had something like a $5 a ton value in China as opposed to more in the US. We had projects in China that wanted to be American projects because that's where their inputs would come from. It just got time consuming. And the important guidance we were given at that point was forget the science of it, forget trying to be ultra complicated, make it a flat $40 a ton, real terms value. Don't allow people any corners to hide in. There is no reason not to apply it. So the application became very important. And that's really when we went to the single value here. Now in 2010, at that point, we decided to go public with what our screening value was. And no shame, the intention was to show Shell that was a progressive company, but also we wanted to kind of nudge others into needing to take a similar approach, because there's always the risk that if you're an oil company looking at the same projects as others in a competitive situation, and you're the only oil company that's applying a $40 a ton CO2 price, you may be disadvantaged. Now, it's all within the kind of, all antitrust laws and things. If you put it in the public domain, make it clear what you're doing, we hope to nudge others into similar action. So 2010 went out, $40 a ton. Now remember, this is the period when things like Waxman-Markey were being discussed in the US. The European Union emissions trading system was trading at the heady heights of about $25 a ton. It's quite stunning now. It's at $7 a ton. Just lost it. We've lost a lot of stuff in the European Union. But Shell decided it was going to go for $40 a ton. I'll talk you through the process of how we get to $40, but we haven't changed it. That's the important thing. It's all about the application. So the learning for us over this period here was keep it simple, but be insistent that every project has to do the same practice. I'm not going to go into detail here, but the message I want to give you is that the CO2 project screening value is treated with the same level of interest, the same level of attention, professionalism, review as every other form of value that's used inside the company. So whether that's an oil price, a gas price, a chemicals price, an input price, it's treated with the same degree of seriousness, which is a very important gain for me, because there was always the danger that I was seen as the fringe guy who kind of had this route straight to the executive, and I got to bypass all the normal checks and balances. We go through the same process as everything else does, so it makes us feel like a grown-up process. We get treated more seriously. So, a bit about what the $40 a ton shadow price or PSV is. So what does it do? The first thing it does is it quantifies the risk. So regardless if we're talking about an explicit form of regulation or an implicit, it puts a value on it. What I mean by that, incidentally, an explicit form of regulation is one where you can actually see the price. You can read it in the papers. When it's a CO2 tax, or you can look at what an emissions trading system, a cap and trade system is trading it, you've got a ready referenceable price, explicit. Implicit is often things like emissions performance standard, design standards, best available technology. Regardless, the $40 a ton puts a value on that altogether. The other thing, the value of the $40 is it's just enough to get project managers to care about the impact of CO2. You will be surprised how quickly a project manager comes to my door when their economics are affected by hundreds of millions of costs related to CO2. So it starts the discussion. It's the start point. It's not the end point. That's important. It's to encourage the projects, the businesses, to look for mitigation opportunities. It's not just to handicap them, but having that impact really starts a conversation. And that's really what the final point's about. Because often I'll say, and I'll say it later, $40 isn't a forecast of the CO2 price. It's an expression of the level of risk tolerance that Shell is willing to bear. So if everything in our portfolio was robust at $40, that's the CO2 risk we will tolerate. So if it goes higher than $40 overall, then we'll take that risk. If it's less, we still have a portfolio that's robust against that CO2 risk. So I think I've covered most of this. Not a price forecast, it's to ensure the portfolio is resilient. It is about building resilience in the portfolio. It's absolutely mandatory. It's not optional, it's what you must do. The one thing it doesn't do is it doesn't consider, for those that follow life cycle emissions or the emissions from the product, it doesn't differentiate between the asset risk. So if you have a refinery, what comes through the stack is against the product risk, the CO2 that's still embedded in the products you sell. It makes no distinction. The $40 is a proxy for all of that. And the other thing is it's not negotiable, as I said. I keep reinforcing this. The simplicity is its real advantage. It just makes sure there is nowhere to hide from its application. Now, for those that are not aware, the CDP Carbon Disclosure Project, really, I mean, the amount that organisation has done over the past 5 years is phenomenal and encouraging transparency. So what you can find quite easily is what other organisations are doing when it comes to their practices in terms of CO2 values. Now, you'll see here, and I swear it's coincidence that BP and Shell have almost exactly the same screening value, right? It's an amazing amount of times I find this with BP. There is no collusion. In fact, we really hate the sight of each other. But time and time again, we tend to come up with similar results. Now, I know when I speak to my BP colleagues on a safe basis, they apply the CO2 rules different from us. So they have a more selective basis to which projects apply a CO2 shadow price. And that's the case with these other companies. You'll see there's quite a range here. And the reason is that what they do is, remember I talked about the way that Shell had done things in the past where we actually had a table, time variated, regional variated. That's what these companies do. So there was a great headline last year. Exxon applies a shadow price of $80 a tonne. And suddenly my executive were on to me saying, why are you being so lenient at $40 when until now I've been the bad guy for trying to get $40? But the truth is it's $40 in one region in the 2040s. So I'd imagine, again, I don't know the truth, but I'd imagine if you did some work in the mean or the median, you'd probably get down somewhere towards the $40 level. If you go through a similar process of calculation, you'll probably end up with a similar result. But it's very useful if you haven't come across it, the Carbon Disclosure Project. Having a look at what they do in CO2 management is really quite revealing. So this is a difficult slide I have to apologise for in advance. I've got 4 sections here, but I thought you really need to understand how we derive the CO2 project screening value. It's always a question I get. So I've tried to break it down into 4 stages here. So the first stage is we have what we call a regional CO2 cost analysis. So this is a process that my team goes through every year. So we have 5 regions of the world, and we find that those 5 regions account for around 90% of our CO2 risk exposure. So it keeps it nice and efficient. So we do this exercise 5 times. And I show a difference here in a forecast and a backcast. Let me just explain what that is. So forecast, you understand, from today's position, what CO2 regulation do we see in each region going forward? So what's politically possible? So this is where we work very, very closely with our colleagues inside Shell in government relations, the people that are closest to regulators and legislators, and they help us understand what's likely to happen in that region in the short term. Now, CO2 management, climate change policies are a very, very difficult thing to imagine from where we're standing today. We know the problem, but politically, It's just dynamite trying to make material climate change policy introductions. So what we then do is we look back. So we say, okay, if we look at things like, well, in the run-up to Paris, COP21 this year, we'll be looking at the commitments, the contributions that individual nations make. And what you can derive is using CO2 abatement curves and other things, you can think, well, if China really aspires to that level of reduction, what's the CO2 price that's consistent with that level of reduction, volumetric reduction? And then we backcast. So what does that need to be in the run-up to it? And then we have the really popular task of trying to reconcile the forecast and the backcast. So you can imagine that sometimes these are just so disjointed, it looks almost impossible. But someone has to take the task of reconciling the forecast and the backcast. And that's the things that we do inside my team. So that's stage one. So for each region, we go through this process. We do it every year, but what I get the team to do is 1 year is a deep dive, so we go into a lot of detail, and the following year is a light touch review to see if it's still robust. So with that in mind, the next stage is for each of the regions. I've only showed 3 here because my PowerPoint skills are pretty limited, to be honest. But what we do is we derive a series of regional CO2 cost lines that we expect for the regions. And then we start to feel what the boundaries are, what the ranges are in those periods. And that's useful in itself, because then what we'll do is we do a bit of calibration with work from the International Energy Agency, IEA, and others. We'll look at other scenarios and just understand, are we broadly consistent or are we way out in any region? And if we are, we have to understand it. So it's just, we always go through it in analysis. This is the iterative stage. And then the next stage we go through is the stylized kind of mapping of what those lines look like over time periods. Now remember I talked about what other companies do. So they have time variated, regionally differentiated CO2 costs. Now, I was going to say if I was chief executive of Shell, I don't see much chance of that now, but if there was a CO2 junkie at the head of Shell, that's where we would probably stop. So if there was no fear about projects gaming inside the organisation, that would be the way that we would apply the CO2 shadow pricing. But remember, I keep saying, the simplicity of a flat value makes it compelling. So ultimately, the task then is to collapse this into a single line. And that's where the $40 comes from. Now, in a large company such as Shell, there's governance that guides us on what we have to do. The directors are very, very clear on the processes we go through. There's always accepted ways of doing things. So each year when I recommend what the project screening value should be for the following year, I have to submit 3 things. I submit my preference, which is this one. I submit the continuity case, which is this one. And then I submit what's called my best technical advice, which is when I go through this process, what should the flat value be? And then the senior executive make the difficult decision as which one to choose. So the easy one is Angus gets overruled over almost immediately every year, but then it's between the best technical advice and the continuity. So there are years in the past where the best technical advice is actually to reduce the $40 when it looks as though CO2 regulation will take longer to emerge than what I had previously assumed. And there are years when my recommendation or the best technical advice would be to increase it. But since we went public with the CO2 price we use in 2010, it's remained at $40. And again, the guidance is let's embed it thoroughly before we mess with the price. So it's that kind of point where you have to move away from analysis into corporate behavior. And if everybody should know what the CO2 PSV is in Shell, there is no excuse not to use it. It's simple, it hasn't changed. Regardless of what our view has been on the CO2 regulatory outlook, regardless of whether Copenhagen was a complete disaster or just a small disaster, or whether Lima gave us good hopes for Paris or it gave us cause for concern. it stayed at $40. I'll take questions on this, incidentally, and I think the slides will be available later. So that's how we derive the project screening value. So another question I often gets, so what difference does it make? You know, what does it really do? Okay, it kind of sounds good when you talk about applying it to projects. What impact has it had? So the first thing is, without regulation, there'd be no response inside businesses. When we have a mandatory CO2 shadow price, it starts to price in CO2 mitigation options. So what I mean by that is, in Shell, every project should be taking all the mitigation measures it's got available to it up to the value of $40 a tonne. If there was no shadow price, you wouldn't get that done. So we provide more resilience to the portfolio than we would otherwise. Second thing, it quantifies the risk. So rather than just talk about this abstract risk that will emerge in the future, it starts to put a dollar value on it. As I would say, it takes it from the conversation to the spreadsheet. We can start to do things with it. We can track exposure, see how businesses are doing and all the rest. And that's the third point, is it really makes a difference when you can report the CO2 exposure sums by business, by project, by region, by country, globally, in the same way that you deal with, you know, a cost line. It really adds a level of maturity to the whole topic. And this one becomes very important when we all get into the topic of stranded assets, as it's part of my role to be able to identify those projects, those activities, those assets in the business that, if CO2 regulation really does start to bite, would be the most exposed. So the code is, we call them the tall poppies. You know the saying, in a field of poppies, there's always one or two tall ones that you should focus in on. So I know the tall poppies in the portfolio, and I make sure that the people in charge of those assets, those projects, those activities know that they're in the firing line if or when CO2 regulation really starts to bite. And the final one is new opportunities. So both on a mergers and acquisition basis, as well as new organic opportunities, it's being able to help the business identify, they used to say, the sheeps and the goats, or the wheat and the chaff. You know, it's the good ones from the bad ones. It just helps, it makes it easier. So it's that kind of way, if you look after the pennies, the pounds look after themselves. If you spend enough time quantifying the risk sufficiently, it helps when it comes to actually making the portfolio robust. And incidentally, please don't get the impression that we've got this down to a fine art. I mean, we're still learning, but this is kind of what drives us. So there's a few areas that the project screening value, the PSV, does not help with. So one is operating assets. So once, for businesses that they're not investing, then what do we do with CO2 management when it comes to those? And the other one is, increasingly you come across non-operated ventures. So in the oil industry, what you'll often find is the projects are just too big for one company to carry alone. So we'll have maybe a 50% share, someone else has got 25%, and then, you know, you get various smaller percentages. And often you're not in an operating position, so you don't have the final say. So in those occasions, the PSV doesn't have the same impact. But it's just to say there are other measures. So every major asset in Shell should have what's called a greenhouse gas and energy management plan. So for those that are familiar with things like CO2 abatement curves that show the options to manage it, every major asset in Shell has that. And it's part of my role, again, to ensure it's up to date in order that the asset manager knows what has to be done to manage CO2. The second thing is, for operating assets, besides the project screening value, we also have a target when it comes to CO2 intensity. So for the oil business and for the gas business, we have a level of CO2 intensity we believe will keep us the right side of regulation. It's very demanding. It's going to take a long time to get to it. But it's just to say it's not just about the PSV. There are other levers. And the thing I haven't talked about at all here, I mean, it could talk forever about that one, is adaptation. So this is investing in existing assets to be able to cope with actual physical risk that goes with climate change. So higher sea levels, larger waves, higher ambient, lower ambient operating temperatures. There's a lot is done in that space as well. Non-operated ventures, this is the one that's the most difficult to manage. So when we find ourselves in a project with, which can often be a reluctant partner, what can we do then? Well, the first thing is Shell's own economics always include the PSV. So even if we're not operating, even if we don't have the final say in the design, we make sure we're still completely cognizant of the CO2 risk in that project. Relationship management. This has been really good over the past couple of years as I've been given a lot more license to talk to our partners about why we undertake CO2 management, why it's a serious business risk, and they should do the same. And we have on occasion actually gone out to do some training. So particularly with national oil companies in Asia in particular, we spent quite a bit of time where we take a couple of members out to the other organisation. We'll take them through the way that we manage CO2 in order to help them think about it. Oh, made me think of Malaysia there. That was very good. Petronas music just in time. So that's an important one as well. So it's to say there are occasions where we can't have the influence, but you want to. I'm going to go through this quite quickly. It's related to the impact of the PSV. Remember the tall poppies point I made? It's understanding the businesses, the activities that are most exposed to CO2 regulation. So I have two axes here. On the y-axis, it's the point source, so what's emitted. And in the x-axis, this is the intensity. So this is the well-to-wheel, WTW. And it's the life cycle analysis. And what you get here is if you're in the high category, you really need to keep an eye on these activities going forward. So the types of things there, gas to liquids, flaring activities, oil sands in Canada, always a popular topic when I speak externally, and tertiary recovery. So things like, you know, when we actually need to do some enhanced oil recovery, it's quite energy intensive. So for these activities, what we do then is we make sure, and I think I've got a wee bit here, yep. So in terms of the point source, this risk is covered by the CO2 PSV, what comes through the stack. But the stuff that is not covered by the CO2 PSV, so that's what's in the product, which only gets emitted once the product is consumed, it's making sure that we still have a way of dealing with that. And we have what we call performance standards. So all of these difficult asset classes have to achieve a certain level of CO2 intensity. If those projects want to go forward and be commissioned, they have to make sure that they achieve that level of performance in their design. So again, the reason for mentioning it is I always worry when I talk about the shadow price that it often sounds as though that's the only tool for CO2 management. It's just one tool in the armoury. And the final slide for me is just to show, we talk about carbon critical projects. These are the really large projects in the business. So it's to show how we do that in practice. So very quickly, project economics all must carry the CO2 PSV. So that can have two outcomes, a low net present value impact. So there's very little impact it has in economics. It shows to me that there's not a CO2 risk, and to the project manager it says you're okay when it comes to CO2, progress. Those are the ones that worry me, are the ones where CO2, the shadow price, has a big impact. So what we do there is we then look at the impact. Now there are occasions where it's an upside. So I'll give you one example recently, which is where we have a production in one area of the world, planning to sell in another. Now, when the price for the product is set outside of a regulated environment, there is a period where you get an upside on the CO2 regulation, but you don't have it in your cost. In other words, the price increases to reflect local CO2 regulation, but in your environment where you're manufacturing, you're not affected yet. It doesn't happen often, but it does. And there we look at things like cost recovery, and what's likely to happen. The more regular one is where it's a downside impact. And that's where we then look more intensely at product risks. So what can you do to help the CO2 risk exposure related to the gasoline, the diesel, the chemicals, whatever. But also we start to look at the stranded asset risk. So just how intensive would CO2 regulation need to be before you would really face having to abandon the asset, the field, whatever it is, early. And other things we use often, we do use real options. So I don't know if any of you guys study it. I mean, often you're told it's difficult to apply in practice. We actually use it in CO2 management quite a bit. Think of things like CCS readiness, carbon capture storage. It's too early often to really, burden a project with billions of dollars, but we can make them CCS ready. Stranded asset risk talked about. Value erosion calculator, it's just a very quick lookup for the project manager to understand the impact of CO2 regulation on his project value. And I think that's more or less it. So my summary here, it wraps up just in time, is kind of 3 things I'd appreciate you taking away. So the first is Shell deals with climate change as a major business risk. We've acknowledged it for a long time. My team are dedicated to CO2 management, but it's making sure we have an impact on the business. The real driver is robust assets, competitive products. I'm afraid we work in a capitalist society. I work for a capitalist commercial company, and this is what gets people motivated. CO2 pricing is just one key in CO2 management, and it's about the portfolio risk. It's not about forecasting the expected CO2 price. And the other thing here is just, we focus on the largest projects. I flew through that last slide. The reason I really focus on the largest projects is it's the 80-20 rule. 80% of the exposure is in 20% of the assets, and those are the ones we need to find. And we have aspirations for the operating assets, and there's one member of my team is almost dedicated to adaptation, and if she knew I went through the whole thing without one of her slides, she'd have kittens, but please don't tell her. And that really is me. So I think, Sally, if you want to invite questions, I'm happy to take those.
Sure. Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. Okay, we have time for some questions, and let's start with students. That would be a good place to start. Okay, students, yeah, please.
Is there a convenient conversion between dollars per ton of CO2 emissions and dollars per barrel of oil?
There is, and you put me on the spot trying to remember it. I'd have to come back to it. I mean, the one that's on my mind just now is the dollars per ton to dollars per gallon of fuel, because we just looked at it in the low carbon fuel standard. So there, the cost.
Multiply by 42.
Oh, there you go. Just been told you multiply by 42. The one the way I remember it is $12 a ton CO2 could translate to about 12 cents a barrel on the cost, 12 cents a gallon on the cost of your gasoline. But if you want to know that, it's a straightforward calculation. We often do it, but I tend to think of in dollars per ton.
Okay, all right, more students. Yeah. Please, yeah.
Just to clarify, so is the point of the project screening value that the project would still need to be profitable if carbon costs your company $40 a ton?
Yeah, so let me make it clear. It's not a binary point. You don't get to a point that unless you're profitable, you progress. If you're in a marginal situation or a situation where the project looks to be out of the money at $40 a ton, it has to be referred to director level approval to progress. So there are occasions that what would happen is, remember, my job is to make sure that we go into this with our eyes wide open. So it's that the CO2 risk is acknowledged. So it's not a mechanical process where you then say, or go or not go. It's to make sure that you start the real discussion. Because believe you me, when you impact the projects in terms of, millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions in the bottom line, people are pretty interested in knowing about your assumptions, the timings and all the rest. And that's the discussion you have.
Okay, all right, how about over there? Yeah.
Is Shell looking into CO2 capture and storage technology?
Yep.
And because I'm sure there's plenty of skills that Shell has that is transferable to such an industry as well.
Yeah, it's one of the responsibilities I have is carbon capture and storage, CCS. So we have currently, I always say 2.5 projects. So Quest is in Canada, that's on oil sands. So we have a CCS project in development that should be launched this year, in fact, Q3 this year. We have Gorgon in Australia, which is on a gas field with Conoco, and that will start in 2016. And then we're through the process just now of CCS on a gas generation plant in a small country in the north of Europe called Scotland, very insignificant little place. But yeah, your point is very correct. We do have the skills to deal with the storage. It's one of the things we really need to push as an industry and as a company, completely committed to making sure we give it a fair crack of the whip. And people like Sally are always welcome for the kind of academic rigour that these things are done by, but it's a big issue for us.
And what's the price of that now?
Well, the average, external source, the average is $125 a tonne, but there is a big range around it. So it's very, I'm going to give you my best line. I often get told not to say this, so if there's Shell people in the audience, don't tell them I said it. But the danger in CCS is the danger of a mean average, because if you think of the average person, they've got one breast and one testicle. And you never ever meet a person with one breast and one testicle. So I can give you the average value. You know, the average cost is $125 a tonne. But you get projects that are way above that. But believe you me, there are projects that are in the money at $40. So it very much depends on the nature of the project.
Okay.
That's not, is that the only thing people have taken notes on? Is that right?
Okay, how about back there? Yeah.
Is your group also in charge of recommending or valuing the kinds of carbon emission mitigation values and strategies that you were talking about to make up that $40?
No, that's down to the project. So it's a good question. I mean, my job is really, I'm the kind of powder keg that starts that. I'm the point of tension that starts that conversation. So what would happen in practice is the project manager would go to the technical people in the organisation to lay out the options he or she faces in, you know, their project. And then the $40 a tonne will determine which ones are in the money and which are not. Now, the way we do it is we review those plans to make sure they're done properly, but that's another highly technical team that do that. And that's things like, there's really three classes. One is about energy efficiency. The second one's about renewables in place of hydrocarbons in the processing. And the third one's the difficult one, which is carbon capture and storage, which is still, you know, it's relatively expensive.
So you're using the cost of those projects per ton to try and offset the potential risks of each project.
That's right. So imagine if you can, like a supply curve, that's your abatement curve. And as you see, you know, some are valued below 40, those should be done. So the purpose of the PSV is to make sure that anything that costs less than $40 a tonne is undertaken. So that's kind of exactly what you're looking for, is that cut-off line, the mitigation options that are in the money, and the mitigation options that still will require a higher CO2 price.
Okay. All right. We'll go here and then we'll go back to you. So Kareem. Yeah.
So actually, as a follow-up on this question, you said that the $40 allow you to mitigate up to $40, right? So sometimes you might not use all of that $40, and if you go beyond, like if you want to install CCS, you will go beyond $40, and then that option would not be implemented. So historically, across all the projects where you have done mitigation, what is the average cost of CO2 that you have seen so far? I'm assuming it's going to be a little bit less than $40.
Okay, so there's a couple of distinctions that are drawn there. So first of all, the $40 a tonne, if you have options below that, you should be doing them. Right? It's not an option, you do them. For above that, that's where we do get into option territory. So for example, CCS. So if the current average cost is $125 a tonne, it's investing in the real option that makes sense when we get to $125 a tonne. So you can't really derive the value of the optionality that you're managing because they're two different categories. And the other thing I often find in this one is, again, it goes back to that, I won't say it again if they're Shell people, the misleading nature of the mean average. Because what you do in one area of the world that's highly likely to face substantive CO2 regulation short term is very different from what you do in another region. And often when you take an average across the portfolio, it doesn't really give you a feel. So for example, regionally, we expect we'll see early activity in Europe and in North America. And it may be that Southeast Asia is actually taking off a lot quicker. Parts of the rest of Asia and Africa will be relative laggards for other reasons. So your balance in the portfolio could be where you're exposed geographically and not just to the cost of the management options you've done. So it's a more difficult calculation, if you like.
So for a specific project in a specific region, would you go beyond the $40 if you had another project that was cheaper than $40 and then they balance?
Possibly. That's a good example of where it would get down to the project manager having a discussion. And the thing I'm always keen on is because Shell is very, very committed to really pushing for demonstration of CCS, is looking for CCS readiness. So even when it looks to be outside the money, I will push very, very hard to see if the conditions are right to put in some optionality around CCS.
Okay, all right.
I just wanted to make sure I understood what you were saying. So you're saying that you actually have a performance standard for every project has to mitigate up to $40 a ton, or is it optional for the project?
Right, so 2 different things, okay? So, in fact, 3 different things, right? So I have a project with a $40 a ton project screening value. All investment projects have to apply that. Having to apply that should be a suitable incentive that you would do everything up to the cost of $40. Because what it does is it reduces the net impact on the project economics. If you're carrying a cost of $40, so long as the option you've got to reduce a ton of CO2 is less than $40, you should have a sufficient incentive to do it. Outside of that, we have CO2 performance standards. So these are saying for the types of activity most at risk, heavy oil, gas to liquids, these things, there's a design standard that you also have to consider in your your design specification. So it's not just the asset itself, but it's also the products you sell. So it's these tall poppies. If you can already see where you're most exposed to CO2 regulation, we want to ensure that most focus on CO2 management takes place in those. So the PSV applies to everything. The performance standards only apply to the most exposed forms of activity.
Okay, I'll open this up to everybody now. Who has a question? Okay, all right. Maybe we'll start down here, and then we'll move to the back of the room, and then we'll come over here. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the size and shape and structure of your organization and sort of where it fits?
You say you mean
yeah,
group CO2? Yeah.
Yeah. How many people do you have doing this, and where are they, and where do they fit into the scheme? Because having worked in a huge company, I know how these things can be. Yeah. Yep.
So it's a small team, a relatively small team. So it's depending on where I'm resourcing, it's between 15 and 20. So that's in the core group. We call it group CO2. But the important thing is in each of the business units, they also have CO2 management resources. So the role is it's like a function in the center that takes care of things like PSV and performance standards. But inside each of the businesses, when I talk about businesses, incidentally, I think of 3 activities. So we have 3 businesses. So there's 2 upstream businesses from the point of exploration through to delivery of the crude to the refinery. We have upstream Americas, which is the American continent, south to Canada. And then upstream international, which is everything outside the Americas. So that's upstream's Americas, upstream international, and then we have downstream. So refining downwards. And each of those 3 business units will, over time, as the CO2 risk starts to emerge, will resource up to take account of it. So what you've got, the model, if you like, is in the center, you've got a small core of subject matter experts. And in the businesses, you have a resource that will be scaled according to the level of CO2 regulation that's taking place. Okay.
Okay, I think we had one in the back over there, and then we'll come here, and then Mark Thurber will be our last person, and then we've got to wrap up. Okay, yeah.
I have 4 grandsons. Are you perhaps a father?
I am.
And roughly how old, if I may ask, are your children?
CO2 cost per ton, or?
I'm wondering what Shell is thinking about the parts per million of CO2 within some of the time frames that you have shared with us, such as 2050 or interim before that.
Yep. So we undertake the scenario work, which I think you're pointing to. So the difference when Shell does its scenarios compared to others is, as you're pointing out quite correctly, we do not begin with the end point. So we don't start with a 2 degrees, limited impact. The way that Shell builds its scenarios is it said, okay, what are a reasonable set of assumptions when it comes to penetration rates of new technologies, growth rates, kind of the expansion of renewables, the uptake of biofuels and whatever, and then trying to build the kind of maximum that's practically possible from those and seeing what the end result is. So Shell took a lot of criticism a couple of years ago when we released the scenarios, mountains and oceans, neither of which got to 2 degrees. So they're above that, and they're not in the area of kind of major panic, but they don't meet the 2 degrees. But I think it's important in this respect, the job I do is fully encompassing that possible level of regulation. So when I talk about, you remember I mentioned backcasting, when I go out to 2050, that's where we start to say, if the UNFCCC manages to get some form of agreement based on the 2 degree future, what does that mean in terms of volumetric emission reduction? What does that mean for the CO2 price? And that, if you like, is the start of the backcast. And that's where a lot of the thinking on what the CO2 exposure is. And sorry for being flippant, incidentally. I have one daughter, she's 21.
Meanwhile, you spend a lot of money on lobbying to make sure the regulation doesn't happen.
No, I challenge that.
Can we move on? Okay,
Okay.
you had a question here. Yeah, you. Yes, sir. Yes.
In the context of reviewing projects, does Shell examine renewable energies, particularly geothermal, as part of what they might do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I say absolutely. Let me explain that. So first thing is, main part of my work is on risk management, so it's about the core business. But there is a whole level of activity that's about future energies. So it can be about geothermal, it can be about wind, solar, biofuels, whatever it is, methane hydrates, anything. And the challenge we have is it's when it makes commercial sense sufficient to justify the investment. And for geothermal, what we found, for example, we drilled a lot of exploratory wells trying to make a go of it, and it was just too expensive. We just couldn't make it work. I think it's now, where did Texaco go? They went with Chevron, didn't they? Yeah. Chevron have a nice position in geothermal because they've got some great plays in the Java Sea, which makes sense there. But for us, we found it difficult. Wind and solar, we've still got a large wind business. We're currently in solar. We've got a major position in biofuels. So yeah, they are brought in. Now it comes into my area, CO2 management. And the benefit, the uplift it can often have is when it comes to renewables, the CO2 that's avoided is benefits from a $40 PSV rather than is penalised by it. So there's an uplift when it comes to these types of activities. And often the way that works too is if you think of a project, so I'm thinking of Oman here, there's a project where rather than use natural gas for enhanced oil recovery, we're now looking at using concentrated solar power. So because it avoids the emissions that go with the natural gas in the process, the evaluation, the appraisal is being benefited by getting the benefit of the CO2 emissions that are avoided. But no shame about it, it's a commercial decision, it's just difficult for us. But if you look towards the future where we should be playing, it's a lot of activity, a lot of energy is spent on where Shell can viably play with the right returns, the right competencies in alternative energies.
Okay, Mark, you'll have the last word.
Sure, great. So I just wanted to ask, how do you look inside the company at the effect of carbon pricing on demand for your end product and hence on oil price potential?
Yep, just doing it now. So I'm impressed, you man. It's just come up in the last period with some intent. So in much of the developed world now, we're starting to see an actual peak in demand, road transport demand especially. So there is a concern now about how impacted, aggravated that would be by, on top of that CO2 regulation. It's quite a difficult process. It's based on price elasticity and things like this, but trying to actually model what it means. You can either do it very simplistically and use a classic, estimate of price elasticity of demand. We're trying to look at it a bit more nuanced. It's one of the things we need to do better. So that's where we want to go. And in fact, the $40 is pretty brutal, in comparison to something that's got real kind of applied nuance about it. But it's still got us interested enough to make sure that now we want to get a bit more sophisticated. So the short answer is we haven't done it well so far. We're just starting to look at it with more detail.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.